So some basic facts to make us question the way we tend to think about economics and human behavior. Until 5,000 years ago, as far as we can tell from the archaeological record, until 5,000 years ago, money, as we currently understand it, did not exist. About 5,000 years ago, for example, we start to see cuneiform writings that suggest sort of market trade relationships that are being recorded down on paper, or rather not on paper, but on stone. And we start to see very early forms of currency, which when they first start out are things like precious metals. But until 5,000 years ago, that didn't exist, which sounds like a long time, but if you take an anthropological perspective on human history, that's a sliver of time. Not only that, not only was the entire world cashless until 5,000 years ago, but the entire world, for the most part, also did not have what we think of as markets or kind of economies in the capitalist sense of the world, in the sense of a place where there's set prices for things and where you, generally speaking, don't have a close, intimate, personal relationship with the people you're buying things from. It's a transaction, right? That kind of sense of a transactional market with prices, that is really just 5,000 years old. A pretty small sliver of the overall history of hominins. Not only that, but for much of the world, it's even more recent than that. So, for example, for most of the Americas, right, places that sort of were outside of the range of things like the Incan Empire or the Mesoamerican empires, for places like before Russian imperialization, definitely for portions of Africa that laid outside of the realms of the Arabic-speaking empires in the north or other types of empires in the central region, places like Australia, places like Papua New Guinea, places like New Zealand, places like many of the Polynesian islands. For all of those places, it's really been no cash and no sort of impersonal transactional market until 500 years ago or less. For places like Papua New Guinea, even more recently, really the last 100 years. And so if we're going to talk about that as if we're going to talk meaningfully about humans and how human beings treat each other in terms of wealth and in terms of stuff, which is a really critical question, right? When you have a world where we produce enough food for every single human being, but you still have large percentages of people who go hungry at night. When you have a world where we definitely have enough space and building materials for everybody to have a house, but you still have a bunch of people on the street. When you have a world like that, we want to ask these questions about stuff and our relationships with stuff. But if we confine it to this idea of modern economies, we're missing huge parts of the picture of what it means to be a human being and how human beings have dealt with the thorny, tricky issue of stuff and who gets what over the years. So this point of this lecture is to kind of broaden our view a little bit, and also to bring up the fact that as we do broaden our view, we realize that people make economic decisions for all sorts of reasons, not just their own self-interest. So basic Western assumptions we often make about economies do not actually hold true cross-culturally. Humans are embedded in networks of meaning. We're embedded in relationships, right? The baker and the butcher, to go back to that example, are very often a friend or an associate or a family member, right? And that's different than just an impersonal exchange. And also there's meanings that we attach to things. We donate to a religious group because we feel that it's a commandment. We donate to a cause because it means a lot to us. Right now on Facebook, if you're anything like me, you get a request for campaign donations every sort of 3 posts on your Facebook, right? And they usually phrase it not as, hey, get a good return on your investment, although occasionally they do. But usually it's framed more like, this is your last chance to ensure that justice happens, or that we stop the fill-in-the-blank political group. So humans are embedded in networks of meaning and sociality where we make decisions that have to do with all sorts of things other than just our own sort of financial profit. And let me share with you a few examples. The first one is from archaeology, and it's Easter Island. So if you're not familiar with Easter Island, we talked about them last lecture, so you should be. But if you didn't, you pay attention last lecture. I'll just sort of briefly review this. Easter Island, when it was first encountered by European explorers, had this kind of scrubby, grassy vegetation, no trees, and a very small population. That was largely politically decentralized. But it was clear, both from what people were saying on the island and also as we've digged into the soil and found past pollen, that clearly this used to be very forested, a much larger population, and a society that had a very complex political system. But that political system and environmental system in large part collapsed, at least according to what we can tell from archaeology. There's been some pushback on this, but it in large part collapsed because of overuse of trees to roll around and create these large stone heads. And these large stone heads were created as a way of showing off sort of your lineage to establish your spiritual and more so your political leadership within different clans, if you were sort of part of a prestigious clan. So they're status markers and they're religious markers. And far as we can tell, the entire island was deforested as a result of that. Now, if this was purely for your own self, kind of not just self-interest, but your rational self-interest, which is often an assumption of how we think about human behavior. If people were entirely rational in terms of our relationship with stuff and why we buy things or do things, then you would think that at some point somebody says, whoa, 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 those trees are looking pretty scarce. Maybe we stop with the stone heads. But of course, humans are operating based on things like ideology, things like political competition, things like religion. There's a lot more going on here than just balancing a budget or even sustaining a resource. As another example, we in the United States, generally speaking, don't eat cats, or for that matter, bugs. And that's why I have a cat here, adorable little kitty, saying, I'm not food, hooman. And the reason why I say that this shows that humans have a lot more going on than just our own rational pursuit of profit is that we have readily available sources of protein that we have. And I'm going to say this and it's going to sound weird, and I love cats, and I want to clarify that I love cats, and that I abhor the mistreatment of pets. But we have more cats, arguably, than we need in certain parts of the United States, to the point where we have sort of feral cats running amok in forests and decimating the bird populations and stuff like that. And despite having a large population of stray cats, nobody's ever like, well, you know what? There's a lot of hungry people around. Maybe we should start making the cats into food. Nobody says that, right? Nor does anybody say, wow, crap, we have a lot of mosquitoes in Alaska. What if we were to sort of collect those and turn that into a cake or something? Nobody talks like that. And it's because something else is happening other than just a rational sort of assessment of, hey, here's a resource, let's use the resource. We are thinking in terms of culture, right? And pets. Why don't we eat pets? Well, because they're pets, right? We consider them members of the family, so to speak. And so we draw different lines around them. Lines which aren't always necessarily entirely rational. Pigs are every bit as intelligent as many of the animals that we consider pets. Pigs are quite intelligent, and yet we eat pigs and would never eat Fido. So all of this just suggests that there's a lot of culture going on and a lot of meanings that we attach to animals that have nothing to do with their resources. As an example number 3, where culture matters and not just profit, in Max Weber, famous anthropologist / sociologist, one of the fathers of the discipline, wrote a great book back in the day, a little bit dry, but I like it, called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He was writing in the early 1900s, and he observed that generally speaking, in Europe at the time, the Protestant nations, such as England and France, such as England and the Nordic nations, were doing a lot better than the Catholic nations, such as Italy and Spain, economically. Not only that, but he found that in countries like Germany, where there was large percentages of both Protestant and Catholic people, the Protestant people were doing better in terms of entering upper-level management and therefore controlling a lot more of the wealth, whereas it was the Catholic people who were more often serving as wage workers or at best middle management. And his point was, yes, to some degree we can attribute this to things like prejudice or things like, Protestant people hiring other Protestant people to be managers at the time, especially when there was more inter-religious rivalry maybe than there is in Europe nowadays between Protestants and Catholics. But he said that's not really enough of an explanation, partly because it doesn't explain how it got to be the case to begin with, that one group was more in charge of the money in Europe than the other. So he makes this very detailed argument where he essentially argues that Protestantism, and more specifically Calvinist Protestantism and Puritanism, and to some degree also Lutheran theology, had influenced, but especially Calvinist theology, had influenced a lot of European people in places like the Nordic countries, England, a lot of other Protestant nations, within sort of the 1600s, 1700s, right as capitalism was sort of hitting its heyday. These Protestant theologies were as well, and especially Calvinist theologies, which convinced people to view wealth as a sign of being one of God's elect, one of God's predestined chosen, and also at the same time encouraged people to use their money wisely because it was a gift from God, so you should invest it, not spend it needlessly, and also encouraged people not to like party or spend their money on a bunch of booze or something, right? Think back to the American Puritans as a sort of an outgrowth of this type of theology. So, and then also encouraged hard work as sort of a religious virtue, where it was sort of seen as, whereas within the Catholic tradition, monasticism was something done by the, well, monks and nuns, here monasticism was sort of seen as like everybody does it in a sense, but they do it while living out in the world. They're sort of monks in the world. So, as Weber kind of points out, it doesn't take a genius to see where this is going. If you tell a group of people of a certain religious orientation in a country, hey, don't spend a lot of your money, invest it well, work real hard, view your job as a sacred calling, work real hard, you do those kind of concepts, and all things being equal, they're going to make a lot of money and accumulate a lot of money and then pass that money on to their kids. And as he points out, even long after perhaps the religious ideology's gone away, those values, those cultural values kind of keep getting passed on. He uses the example of Ben Franklin, who wasn't particularly Protestant in orientation. He was more of a deist, but he'd sort of been influenced by, right, his cultural environment. And he very much had this sort of capitalist spirit. So it's an interesting little case study, but it kind of makes the point that culture matters a lot more sometimes, and value systems, and even strange things like theology, right? Who would have thought that sort of the complex give and take of theology and the difference between Calvinism and Lutheranism and Catholicism in terms of ideas of salvation, who would think that 300 years later that would be influencing who had the most wealth in Europe? But Weber made a pretty convincing argument that it did. So there's a lot more going on with money than money, is what we're trying to get at here.